Okay. Stephanie, thanks for that introduction. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you all today about my most recent work examining the effects of validation on physiological and behavioral factors contributing to self-inflicted injury in youth. I'm not sure why the text is so large here. We'll have to see if the rest of my slides look normal or not. I'm interested in studying self-inflicted injury among adolescents in light of its connections with borderline personality disorder. Self-inflicted injury is a highly visible symptom of BPD, and it leads many individuals and families to be seeking treatment for self-inflicted injury specifically. We'll talk a little bit about both environmental and psychophysiological indicators of vulnerability for self-harm, and validation as a mechanism that might have potential to reduce risk among these self-injuring youth. Okay, so self-inflicted injury is a devastating and preventable cause of suffering and in some cases death. Unfortunately, such behaviors are really common, and available evidence indicates that our prevalence estimates are actually pretty conservative. So this affects folks of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds, also socioeconomic statuses. So the scope of this problem is incredibly broad. Self-inflicted injury places a pretty immense burden on the U.S. healthcare systems, and although there are a few prospective studies of borderline personality development, self-inflicted injury is likely to be one marker of risk that leads to that outcome later. When I'm talking about self-inflicted injury, I'm using SII or self-harm as an umbrella term covering a really wide range of behaviors that can be characterized across a few key dimensions. Self-injurious acts can vary in terms of the degree of suicidal intent associated with the action, the lethality of the method that's chosen to enact self-harm, or the amount of physical harm that's actually induced by those behaviors. And it's really important to note that while self-harm behaviors can be categorized, people often can't. So many kind of move across this continua of different dimensions over time. And in fact, recent research has found that non-suicidal self-injury at a baseline assessment is actually a stronger predictor of later suicide attempts than suicide attempts themselves as the predictor of later suicide attempts. So that just supports this idea of dimensionality. Self-harm behavior often emerges in adolescence. Suicide is a leading cause of death among this age group, and adolescent females are particularly likely to engage in self-harm, both non-suicidal and suicidal self-inflicted injury. And generally, we haven't done particularly well when treating self-harm through treating comorbid conditions like depression. And self-harm is actually elevated among every clinical diagnosis. So it makes sense to approach self-harm treatment and prevention from a transdiagnostic perspective, identifying core biosocial mechanisms associated with heightened risk and looking across different diagnostic presentations. At the individual level, self-injury results from complex interactions between biological vulnerabilities, contextual stressors, and depleted resources for problem solving. The biological, behavior, and emotional systems are constantly transacting within our social context. And so it's easy for us as researchers to sort of forget one part of this equation when we're designing our studies, but evidence indicates that we actually are better able to explain outcomes of interest when we look at behavior and biology concurrently. So we really need a multiple levels of analysis approach, like Amy so nicely set up for us, to get a handle on the etiology and maintenance of complex problems like personality pathology and self-injury. So Amy also did a great job setting up some of the background for my talk. So on the biological end of the equation, we know that parasympathetic nervous system influences on the body are involved in self-regulation and can be assessed through cardiac activity, specifically through respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is that variability in the inner beat interval as you breathe. When we're in a non-stressful resting state, our vagus nerve puts a braking inhibitory effect on our heart rate, and that's withdrawn when we're under stress so that we can flexibly respond to our environment. Generally, higher resting respiratory sinus arrhythmia indicates better capacity for emotion regulation, and let's see here. RSA reactivity to emotion evocation maps onto in-the-moment regulation. Again, theoretical and empirical evidence suggests that high RSA is typically protective, whereas low RSA tends to mark vulnerability to emotion dysregulation. Previous research with self-inflicted injury shows that attenuated RSA and a negative slope on RSA reactivity under stress among that population. My graduate lab found that self-injuring teens and their mothers display RSA decreases to aversive behavior when they're engaging in a conflictual discussion task, whereas control adolescents and their mothers showed RSA increases when they or their dyad partner became more aversive, and that's consistent with better physiological regulation to stress. On the environmental side of the equation, we know that one of the most salient developmental contexts is that parent-child relationship. And again, leading models highlight the importance of both emotion dysregulation and problematic interpersonal dynamics to both self-inflicted injury and borderline personality disorder. And we know that both emotion regulation and dysregulation are shaped within the parent-child relationship. Adolescents also typically report that self-harm is precipitated by family conflict. And then, as most of you are probably familiar, Linehan's invalidating environment theory is a sort of main etiological theory of self-harm development. And the idea here is that a child may be temperamentally vulnerable to negative affectivity, and when that's combined with a familial contextual context that intermittently reinforces emotional lability, anger, or rigid emotional inhibition, that tends to lead to problems. There are also these coercive processes that we've been talking about where kind of aversive actions can get escalated within the family context, and all of that is really risky for self-inflicted injury and borderline personality disorder. So we know that environmental risk factors like conflict escalation and emotional invalidation can be targeted with interventions, but we have sort of a limited understanding of how such interventions immediately affect biological and behavioral indices of risk. And because psychophysiological patterns can change really rapidly in response to environmental cues, it could be possible that we could detect the effects of environmental manipulations at this level of analysis and then link that back to observable behavior. Frizzetti and Schenk have found that, as we would expect, invalidation is generally associated with RSA decreases, and validation is associated with RSA increases, as we might expect. Okay. So which interventions are likely to be most helpful? We know that self-harm is associated with ineffective and rigid coping strategies like social withdrawal, threats, ultimatums, emotional suppression, and blame. And as I mentioned earlier, parents of self-injuring children are often inadvertently shaped into interaction patterns that reinforce irritability, anger, and emotional outbursts in their kids. So intervening at the parent-child level to interrupt this coercive family process, provide alternative strategies, and promote affiliation and belongingness among these families may be a particularly fruitful port of entry for reducing risk. Now, we already have effective family-based interventions for adolescents with self-inflicted injury, such as dialectical behavior therapy, but the mechanisms promoting those improvements that we've seen are not fully understood. So one key strategy for promoting healthy interactions is interpersonal validation. What I mean by validation is a response in which one person expresses a private emotional experience and they're met with understanding and acceptance from another person of their own perspective. We know that interpersonal relationships that involve higher levels of validating responses are associated with better emotion regulation. And DBT skills training actually offers a strategy for promoting validation called GIVE. The goal here when we teach this strategy is we're telling clients that they're attempting to understand one another, not prove them right or wrong. And you can validate someone without endorsing or agreeing with their perspective or actions. This functions to increase understanding and may naturally de-escalate conflict. So with this study, We attempted to understand parent-child interactions relevant to self-harm via concurrent assessment of behavioral, affective, and physiological processes, both during conflict and also following a manipulation where we taught the give skill. So I recruited 60 teenage girls for this study. Half were community controls without any history of DSM diagnosis or engagement with self-harm. Half of the girls had self-injured at least 3 times prior to study enrollment. And clinical adolescents were largely recruited through both inpatient and outpatient therapy settings, and they varied in terms of the number of self-inflicted injuries that they had, the lethality of their chosen means, and their reported intent to die by self-harm. And this was done really deliberately to capture a range of girls that are engaging in self-harm. We also recruited adolescents' mothers. I excluded participants taking medications that have well-documented effects on psychophysiological responding, so things like beta blockers, and all participants were asked to refrain from taking anti-inflammatory agents, stimulants like caffeine, and antihistamines for at least 24 hours prior to coming into the visit so that we could minimize the effects of medication on the results that we found. And as you can see, the majority of my sample identified as non-Hispanic Caucasian, which is representative of the area of the nation that we recruited them, which was Utah. Our clinical and control samples were fairly well matched in terms of age. And I do want to mention here, I'll come back to this later, but 11 clinical adolescents and 4 clinical mothers reported some previous exposure to DBT before enrolling in our study. And the degree of their experience with DBT really varied from brief skills training while hospitalized, just getting whatever skills they happened to be teaching that day, to full program DBT in an outpatient setting. Okay. So eligible families were invited to a lab visit where they provided informed consent. They were interviewed with the SCID and instructed to complete self and informant report measures. We had participants prepared for psychophysiological data collection, and we collected 5-minute resting recordings. Participants all completed an individual baseline for 5 minutes and then also a dyadic baseline with their child or parent so that we could assess potential influences of the social context on resting RSA. Mother-daughter dyads then completed a discussion-based tasks, really similar to the one that Amy was describing, where we wanted them to disagree. It was designed to provoke disagreement. In this case, we used a measure called the issues checklist, which lists off a whole bunch of topics that teens and parents often have conflict about, like curfew, keeping your room clean, fighting with siblings. And we identified at least 3 items that they marked as anger-inducing on this measure to have them discuss during the conflict task. So they talked for 10 minutes about something conflictual, and then we had them provide ratings of how difficult the task was, how much effort they were putting into the task, as well as any urges to self-harm. They also completed a copy of the PANIS to get at subjective emotional experiences during the discussion. We then had them watch a 17-minute video on interpersonal validation and the give skill. The video informed clients that conflict is a normative interpersonal experience, taught the different levels of validation from DBT, and also how to use the give skill. It wrapped up with a role play of a family where we popped up which part of the give skill they were using in text as they were watching the video, so they could sort of see the give skill in action. And prior to filming that, I contacted 3 DBT certified trainers who rated my script for clarity, comprehensiveness, and delivery, so I could make sure I was really teaching the give skill and not something else. And then after the video, families were asked to use the give skill to validate their interaction partner and repair the conflict from earlier in the visit for 10 minutes. They then rated their perceived closeness to their interaction partner, how resolved the conflict felt, how much effort they put in, how difficult the task was, as well as their self-harm urges. We collected respiratory sinus arrhythmia at baseline and also in 30-second epochs during the study tasks. We coded adolescent and mother behaviors with the System for Coding Interactions and Family Functioning Scale, the SCIF. This scale assesses family dynamics, especially with respect to how conflict, disagreement, and problem solving are managed. And the system has codes that are for each individual within the family, and then also sort of a dyad or family level code as well. I selected 4 behavioral codes per level of functioning based on both relevance to self-harm and the give skill in particular. Okay, so given the nested nature of the data within person over time, I used multi-level modeling for this study. Moms and teens were examined in separate analyses across the board. So first, I was interested in understanding how self-harm and suicidal urges would be affected by the task across my groups. There was a significant main effective group on urge to self-harm among adolescents, such that clinical teens reported stronger self-harm urges at baseline, which is not surprising. But main effects of the tasks on these variables were not significant. So basically, the study didn't do anything to increase or decrease risk in the moment. Next, I wanted to explore participants' subjective experiences of and their engagement with study tasks. So clinical mothers reported more negative affect following the conflict discussion compared to control mothers. However, no group differences emerged on positive affect, and their affect didn't significantly change following the repair task. Teens presented with the same pattern during conflict, with clinical participants reporting more negative emotions compared to controls, but the repair task was associated with fewer negative emotions across teens among both groups, which is consistent with what we might hope to see following successful implementation of the give skill. Negative affect is going down for these kids. Clinical moms and teens reported feeling less close to their interaction partner compared to control participants, and they also felt like their conflicts were less resolved. There were no group or task-based differences on perceived difficulty of the task, so everybody thought it was about the same in terms of difficulty. But you can see here that clinical mothers rated their interactions with their daughters as significantly more effortful compared to control mothers across the tasks. So we have some idea of how participants subjectively responded to study tasks, but what did they do behaviorally and how did they respond psychophysiologically? I next assessed the effects of task on participant behavior and on RSA and explored whether those associations were modified by group. Okay, so I'm excited to report that participants' behavior did shift by task. In fact, all family level behaviors changed as we predicted following exposure to the give skill. There were main effects of tasks across groups such that the give practice was associated with increased cohesion and positive affect and decreased negativity and conflict, and more family-focused problem solving. The decrease in negativity and conflict was especially pronounced for clinical participants. They're represented there by the blue line. Okay, let's talk about moms' behavior specifically. As expected, clinical moms demonstrated more coercion and less emotional support for their kids compared to control mothers when we were talking in the conflict task. However, there are no group differences observed for maternal invalidation and rejection or maternal withdrawal, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Most mother-level behavioral codes shifted in the expected direction following give skill practice. Across participants, maternal emotional support increased during the repair condition relative to conflict, whereas invalidation and rejection generally decreased in that condition. A group by task interaction emerged such that clinical moms were significantly less coercive during repair as compared to that first conflict discussion. Okay, let's talk about teens. So during conflict, clinical adolescents demonstrated more anger and frustration, as well as opposition and defiance relative to controls. And I next examined the effects of the give manipulation, and here, clinical teens' opposition and defiance significantly decreased when practicing give, and decreases in opposition were trending among controls. There was no main effect of task on anger. However, there was a significant group by task interaction where clinical daughters' anger significantly decreased following the give skill. Okay, so let's talk about RSA. Clinical moms displayed lower resting RSA during individual baseline relative to controls, and their RSA significantly increased in the presence of their daughters. Control mothers' RSA didn't shift from individual to dyadic baseline, and there were no group differences in maternal RSA during dyadic baseline. RSA generally increased across participants during conflict, and contrary to expectations, RSA didn't shift from conflict to the repair task. Let's see here. So teen RSA generally aligned with mothers, but they had lower RSA across both baseline tasks. And again, RSA increased in that conflict discussion and didn't change significantly for the repair condition. So finally, given the theorized links between behavior and psychophysiological regulation, I explored the influence of participant behavior on both mother and teen RSA. As an initial step here, I regressed maternal RSA and teen RSA separately onto mother-level behavior, including only the 4 specific mom codes in the model, adolescent-level behavior, and then family-level behavior. The 6 models were each compared to a null model containing only group and centered age as predictors, because I really wanted to establish that these levels of behavior predicted RSA beyond the effects of group and age alone. Likelihood ratio tests revealed that each level of behavior was doing something to predict RSA beyond age and group for models of both maternal and teen RSA. So given these findings, I next explored potential unique effects of each of the 12 behavioral codes I collected, and all tests were corrected for multiple comparisons using a Bonferroni adjustment. One behavioral code significantly predicted maternal RSA when looking at it in this fashion. There was a main effect of teen sadness such that higher displays of sad behavior by daughters was related to higher maternal RSA, but this was qualified by a significant interaction such that clinical mothers demonstrated significantly lower RSA when their daughters were displaying sadness. No specific code uniquely predicted RSA among teens post-adjustment. Okay, so what can we take from all of this? I know I walked you through a lot of stuff. Clinical dyads displayed more risky interaction patterns than controls when discussing their problems initially without any kind of guidance. Behavioral indicators of interpersonal struggle also aligned with participants' own perceptions. So clinical dyads reported feeling less close to their interaction partners compared with control participants, and they felt like their conflicts were less resolved. So these families know that they're struggling. It was surprising, but there weren't any group differences on maternal invalidation and rejection, and this was unexpected given that invalidation is a really key etiological mechanism proposed to underlie self-harm development. However, I do want to point out that clinical mothers were generally more coercive than control moms, and this specific code captures behaviors like threatening, bullying, shaming, embarrassing their child, or acting superior. So some of what is discussed in invalidating environment theory was captured by this coercion code instead. Clinical mothers also expended more perceived effort than control mothers across study conditions. So simply interacting with their kid may be more effortful for these moms, and that could be really promising, indicating that they're really engaged with this discussion, but it also probably means that they're tired and that this is challenging for them. Taken together, study findings indicate that clinical dyads are in greater need of alternative strategies to manage disagreement compared with controls. Clinical moms and teens generally had lower baseline RSA compared with controls, which is often linked to greater emotion regulation difficulties. And I thought it was really interesting that clinical mothers demonstrated RSA increases in the context of sitting with their child. I thought this might indicate clinical moms are more alert and perhaps anticipating a greater need for physiological regulation in the presence of their daughter. RSA also increased during the conflict condition relative to baseline across all participants. And this isn't necessarily surprising, as RSA also maps on, in addition to emotion regulation, also maps on to things like attention and effort. And we would expect that that would increase in a discussion-based task relative to sitting quietly for baseline. We might see a little bit more interesting findings and dynamic shifts if we were able to look at this across the entire task using those 30-second epochs instead of averaging them together. A dynamical systems model would be really helpful for examining those actor-partner effects. So a big takeaway here is that teaching the give skill one time on one occasion resulted in behavior changes that we might hope to see post-intervention. I mean, look at all the domains that shifted following teaching the give skill. Clinical families appeared to benefit most from teaching this skill, which isn't surprising, but even control families seem to glean some higher level problem-solving skills, like shifting the focus of the problem from being solely or mostly a child's responsibility to discussing problems as being more influenced by multiple parties within the family. And then finally, I was pretty excited to find that behavior as coded on the SCIF appeared to predict some variance in maternal and teen RSA. Although this was exploratory, and although a lot of the individual codes didn't survive correction for multiple comparisons, I thought the fact that we found this in a relatively small sample was pretty heartening. And it supports a growing movement in the field toward assessing multiple levels of analysis in order to better understand the complete picture here. Before I finish up, I want to acknowledge a couple of limitations and talk about where this research might be headed next. Although I used a repeated measures design, my sample was fairly small and potentially underpowered to detect some effects. The sample was fairly diverse in terms of self-inflicted injury history, but the majority of participants identified as Caucasian, non-Hispanic, and all were female. So these results really need to be replicated in a larger and more diverse sample. Furthermore, most teens are living in a family context that looks a little different than just mom and kids. So usually there's a second caregiver, there's siblings and or extended family, and future research should examine the effects of teaching validation to the entire family system, where interactions are almost certainly more complex. We, through Amy's research that she just presented, talked about the context of daily life, but there are still many questions left to be answered. If we teach this skill, how does that affect their regulation out in the real world? Can we see these effects replicated in the wild, so to speak, as Stephanie said? And as I mentioned earlier, we could benefit from looking at actor-partner effects dynamically across these conversations. Finally, it's worth exploring how repeated exposure to the give skill affects these outcomes. So some of my clinical participants had prior exposure to DBT, but we really didn't assess this carefully enough. So we don't know, did they have exposure to the give skill specifically? What did that look like? We don't know. So it's possible that some of the beneficial effects we saw here could have been due to multiple exposures for some of these folks. And longitudinal research is needed to assess the longevity and generalizability of these effects that we saw here, and how they relate to things like changes in psychophysiological reactivity over time, and obviously how often people self-injure out in the real world after exposure to these skills. Well, thanks very much for listening to my presentation. I'd like to acknowledge the fabulous people and agencies that made this study possible, and turn it over to you for any questions. Yeah.
Throughout both talks, I've been puzzled. I'm not familiar with the equipment for RSA.
Sure.
Is it controlled for both heart rate and respiratory rate?
Yes.
Otherwise, those would be contact.
Yeah. Yeah, there are algorithms built in to help correct for those things. And there also are developmental effects on breathing rate that you need to account for as well. But we're able to do that, yeah. Thanks.